Coming up on Chasing the Natty, we're continuing our crash course series for all of you who need to be caught up on what you need to know for the college fantasy season. Today, we're going to look at the wide receivers as we discuss the top 36 in our Campus to Canton CFF teams rankings, who all is going too high and too low in drafts, and finally, what competitions we have our eye on during the fall camps. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
To go, breaks a tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton past the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton! Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye, touchdown Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus to Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the off season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we are doing here, head on over to campustocanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We've got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF Redraft, Best Ball, Devy, Campus to Canton Leagues, College IDP, College DFS, Underdog Best Ball, anyone? Really, if you play it, we've got the content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me and the show on Twitter. I am at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty. And we have another handsome fellow joining us here today, y'all. Could not find another John to join us, so I went and found the next best thing. I found me a Joe. Everyone, please welcome on Mr. Joe Arpasi, owner of LetPurpleRain.com. Both a new and old face in the CFF community. Joe, welcome on. Glad to have you on, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's glad to be back in the saddle again after a long time out. Used to be doing CFF Analyst work from 2008 to 2016 and ended up kind of going away when our website got shut down and decided to get back in the saddle here this year and just really looking forward to getting back in the mix with this.
You definitely bring a unique perspective already. I've been checking out a lot of your stuff over at letpurplerain.com. Go check out his Substack. Again, just letpurplerain.com. Tons of fun stuff on there. My personal favorite is your Diary of a Draft Man series, where you really just go through and break down the teams that you recently drafted, talk about what other people did with their drafts. Basically, if you're a big fan of what we do with our live drafts every Sunday night, Joe basically takes a lot of those and other drafts that he's in, and he provides his own thoughts on them. And so if you just like draft breakdowns, absolutely worth going to check out over there. Probably one of the more unique pieces of content you'll find in the CFF space right now. So, Joe, you are back into the CFF world. Again, I talked about your Diary of a Draftman series. What other stuff are you kind of working on?
Yeah, so this is a brand new website. I'm going to be doing year-round CFF coverage. Right now, since we're in draft season, you can find draft guide, draft strategy analysis, the mock draft recaps, like you mentioned, of the Diary of a Draft Man. And right now we're starting to do player news updates and fantasy stock reports of which guys' fantasy stocks are going up and down. And then as we head into the first week of the season, in season, I'm going to do waiver wire analysis. Which players should you keep or drop on your roster to make room for the waiver wire guys? Weekly player rankings, as well as start sit. And then coverage will be going all year long. So when next spring comes, it's going to be all over the spring camp. It's basically going to be giving you all year coverage. And also to mention for those of you with Let Purple Rain or the UW _purple_rain, it is rain as in REIGN.
That's probably a good point. I should have clarified that. I can absolutely see enough people thinking about Prince to start wondering, where's Jared sending me here? I can't find this guy.
Or just it's Seattle and it rains.
That is also very true. I didn't even think about that. So like I said, Joe, just exploding onto the scene right now with your great content right now. Everybody should go absolutely check that out. And that was part of the reason why I'm so excited to bring you on here for wide receivers, man. You specifically, when I asked you to come on to this Crash Course series, you were excited about coming on to discuss the wide receivers. I guess before we kind of get into them too deep here, I'll just ask you, like, why specifically were you excited to talk about wide receivers?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do is I have a historical database of player and coaching team and player stats that are associated specifically to individual coaches. And it goes back to 2018, minus the 2020 season. And one of the things I track is what receiver roles were the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, and wide receiver 3 every year. So was it an outside receiver? Was it a slot receiver? Was it a balanced mix, someone that plays in both? And then having that as part of this database allows me to be able to look at receiver situations. And as we'll go into it today, where I'll be able to say, here's the name of someone who's being drafted a lot, but I'm kind of pushing somebody else because this particular coach favors this particular wide receiver role.
So let me ask you about this, because this is something that we at Campus to Canton kind of go back and forth on, right? In terms of, how much is it the head coach? How much is it the individual offensive coordinator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can have a guy that for years it seems like, this is a Jeff Traylor wide receiver system, right? Like, he's the guy that kind of points at who gets the targets, but then all of a sudden his offensive coordinator changes, and turns out it might have been that guy. A great example of this is Ben Arbuckle versus Zach Kittley, right? Where we saw when Ben Arbuckle was with Zach Kittley, man, that slot got hit hard. And then as soon as those two split up, Zach Kittley suddenly no longer a slot heavy. Meanwhile, everywhere Ben Arbuckle goes, that's where the slot continues to get dominated. So how do you kind of keep track of that?
Basically, every offensive coordinator and head coach is tracked from every year, 2018 up through last year. So when you put in one individual coach like Ben Arbuckle, I will see his specific history. And then if there's so if you're looking at a head coach and offensive coordinator and you're not really sure who might be calling the shots, I can see both. I can kind of look between both data, make up my mind. Other situations, you just might know it's the offensive coordinator. And so I'll just ignore the head coach and just go off of the coordinator, or vice versa. But basically, even when there's dual offensive coordinators, each guy gets that year's stats assigned to him in this database. So I could pull up a head coach and 2 coordinators for any team when I'm looking at stuff to try and make these evaluations. And, having a large sample size helps, but at the same time, sometimes you just don't have great data. Sometimes you do. And it just kind of is a one-off situation. Every school, every situation you look at.
So let me ask you, because this is something that I'm sure people are kind of wondering about as we're talking about this, and we'll talk about this situation a little bit more later in terms of how it applies to the particular wide receivers for this year. But like a case like Ohio State, right, where Ryan Day's been calling plays pretty much since he's been head coach there, but now he's bringing in Chip Kelly. How are you kind of squaring away who's going to be in the driver's seat, kind of projecting that offense out?
Yeah, I definitely have notes on that, since we're going to be talking about some of these Ohio State receivers today. I kind of fall back on the very simple phrase of Chip Kelly would not have taken that job if he had to run somebody else's offense. Mm-hmm. And so for Ohio State particularly, I'm just using Chip Kelly's history.
Okay. All right, then we'll take a look at that, and that'll definitely impact how you are viewing some of these guys here later.
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to go into detail on it.
We'll get right to that, but first, you guys know me. I got to hit on a couple of spiel things here. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly here today. First one up here, obviously, is our CFF guide over at campusatcanton.com. It's got team profiles for all 134 teams, 200-plus player profiles, and a ton of other stuff. I'm not going to go into all the detail like I usually do because we don't have time for that, but what I will say is we're going to cover a lot of wide receivers here today. We're not going to be able to cover everybody, unfortunately. I'll throw out a lot of names, and we'll kind of touch on some guys here and there. Some guys we'll go deeper on. But if you want pretty in-depth looks at pretty much the top, let's see, how many wide receivers we go deep on this thing? 72? 72 wide receivers we got full player profiles for in this guide. That is the place to go. If we didn't touch on the player that you are the most interested in, go check out the CFF guide. Most likely we've got them there for you to take a look at. So, In addition to that, make sure you go check out the latest episode Defending the Natty with myself and Nate Marquise, where we try to predict what a 2025 first round draft for a CFF Dynasty draft is going to look like after this season. So a lot of projection, a lot of trying to predict the future. It was a bit of a wild one, especially in the second half once we both started deviating down different paths. So go check that out. In addition, check out all of our CFF draft live streams we've been doing on YouTube every Sunday. We've had a ton of great guests this off season, tons of different perspectives that we brought on. We've done a couple of different draft types. We've done a Power 4 only draft. We've done G5 only draft. We have done a 6-point passing touchdown only draft. I probably should have snuck in a tight end premium draft in there at some point, but I don't know. Oh well. Notes for next year, but tons of great stuff. Joe, I know you've joined us on several of those, not in the actual show, but you've joined us in the drafting as well. And so go and check out the rest of those. With all that being said, that's enough spieling on my part, Joe. Let's go ahead and talk about some of these wide receivers.
Let's get at it.
So first things first, I'll name off the top 12, and then we'll go into detail on a few of these guys here. At wide receiver 1 in our Campus Canton CFF teams rankings, we have Torrey Horton, the wide receiver out of Colorado State. At wide receiver 2, we have Luther Burden, the wide receiver out of Missouri. At wide receiver 3, we have Tetairoa McMillan, the wide receiver out of Arizona. At wide receiver 4, we have Jalen Royals, the wide receiver out of Utah State. At number 5, we have Tej Johnson, wide receiver out of Oregon. At 6, we have Pafele Ashlock, the wide receiver out of Hawaii. At wide receiver 7, we have Joey Hobert out of Texas State. At number 8, we have Ricky White, the wide receiver out of UNLV. At number 9, we have Evan Stewart, the other wide receiver out of Oregon there. Number 10, we have Xavier Restrepo, the wide receiver out of Miami of Florida. At number 11, we have Will Pauling, the wide receiver out of Wisconsin. And rounding out the top 12 wide receivers here, we have Kevin Concepcion at NC State. So, Joe, before we kind of get into our main guys here, this is going to be our chance to talk about just the wide receiver class in general. And coming into this year, man, I immediately identified like 6 guys. I'm like, okay, these are going to be the 6 clear-cut guys that are in it. It's going to be a bit of a drop-off afterwards. And like, I usually do pretty good at finding value at wide receiver later in drafts. But, man, it felt like at the beginning of this offseason that like Torrey Horton, Luther Burden, Tetairoa McMillan, Jalen Royals, Kevin Concepcion, and I can't remember I had 6, but there was like a clear top 6 guys. Oh, and Ricky White. Those are like my clear top 6 guys. Ever since then, it feels like the offseason has done its damnedest to slowly chip away at that top tier and raising questions for each of those guys that all felt like such huge, or it felt like such safe values at the beginning of the year, to the point, really, in my opinion, the only 2 wide receivers that should go in the first round of CFF drafts at this point are Torrey Horton and Luther Burden. Mm-hmm. Because most of these other guys here, and again, we'll go into detail on one of these guys here in a minute here, but Tetairoa McMillan, injury concerns there now. Ricky White, change at quarterback that potentially could impact the passing game of UNLV moving forward. Kevin Concepcion, we have seen NC State load up on all of these talented receiving options out of the portal. And then Jalen Royals, of course, most recently getting absolutely hammered by the fact that he loses his head coach. Now, granted, there's reason to still be excited, which is why we still have him in our top 4 guys here. But suddenly these guys that felt really good as first-round values probably don't feel nearly as good as they did. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my read on the top of the guys here. What about you, Joe? You kind of feel the same way about the top-end guys here? And then what do you feel about the wide receiver class in general?
You know, looking at the top-end guys in the class in general, some of the top guys I'm a little down on compared to the consensus of the CFF universe here. But the biggest thing that jumped out to me is I don't see any of what I would call a tier 1 stud. And Ashton Genty. You know, like I don't see that same equivalent at wide receiver. And the way I kind of put together my draft guide and view players is like tier 1 through 3 players are guys that I feel like these are solid starters on my roster. And so I don't really see any tier 1 guys. I see a lot of tier 2 and 3 guys. So like some of these concerns you're bringing up about T-Mac, I view him in that tier 2, tier 3 range. I don't view him as a tier 1 like a lot of other people do. And there's a lot there's enough tier 2 guys that I actually feel like you can wait a little bit at receiver. You don't have to go first round or even second round, and you can land one of these guys in the top 16, that you guys have ranked. You can get them, but in the third round. So that's one thing that I like, is I think that you can get some good value, but I do think like guys I view in like a second tier, they definitely stand out from the guys in the third tier. And then once you kind of get below that into guys that are kind of borderline starters, really good bench players, there's a huge, huge pool of receivers that I really like. And I think there's tons of value in the middle rounds and late rounds for flyers that I really love shopping for value this year at receiver. And I think it's one of the more heavily loaded position groups up toward the top, in that range of tiers where you can find starters or guys that are just on the cusp of being starters.
So I found it interesting when I'm looking at your notes here. Again, we'll get into some guys later that we think are going too high and too low. And you listed your rank there, but you didn't list your rank. You listed what tier you have them in. Mm-hmm. And your tier 3, let me see if I can find it real quick.
It's big.
This isn't a tier, my guy. Again, I'll poke a little fun here. Like, this isn't a tier. This is wide receiver, what was it, 19 through 72, I think, off the top of my head.
And here's the funny thing. So I place guys in tiers based on my fantasy projections, and the point difference between tiers is not very big. I literally just see that many receivers that are all really similar based on my personal projections. So that's why, and the other thing that you're kind of commenting on, I don't like doing traditional rankings. I kind of view anyone who's in a tier is equal with everyone else in the tier. And then you go out and grab the guys that you like the best from that group. So it allows more flexibility and fluidity when you're drafting, versus some people get hung up, this guy's ranked 15th, but this guy's ranked 20th. If they're in the same tier, is there really that much of a difference?
No, I mean, I think everybody does that to some level, right? Like, I have my guys all listed out, but even still, like, if I'm in a draft, right, and I'm looking at, let's take my wide receiver 16 through 19 here. I got Malachi Fields, Burgess, Egbuka, and Bernard, right? There have been multiple drafts where I look at that tier and I say, you know what? I'm feeling Bernard today. I'm feeling Bernard. I'll take him ahead of the 3 guys ahead of him, right? Now, I don't necessarily do where I view my wide receiver 19 roughly the same as my wide receiver 72, but I get what you're saying, right? And I think a lot of people subconsciously agree with that as well, because nobody, I don't think, really goes directly by their rankings every single time, because especially once you get to a point where you draft a single guy a lot, everybody starts getting a little hesitant about drafting them continuously throughout the entire offseason, unless you are just the most diehard true believer of that player ever.
Yeah, and what type of player you're drafting and where you are in the draft also dictates where you should go. With running back, for example, I want more established players, people who have a proven track record in fantasy, guys who have higher floors, even if it means maybe they don't have the highest ceiling. So I'll dip down a tier to grab one of those guys instead of getting more of a like a sleeper type or we think he's the next man up type who could be at a higher tier. So there's a lot of, that's why I say I like having that fluidity in the way that you can view things, because there are some people, and a lot of times it could be newer people, but they will just fixate on a ranking number. And that's why I also like to say, like, don't judge my projections straight by the number. Have some fluidity in how you do things. So I do break up, the 2 main things I break up players by is like, how much reliability do they have? And then, grouping them in tiers. And then within a tier, you can see, hey, this guy's more reliable than that guy. And so it allows you that flexibility.
No, for sure. It's kind of a similar thing I do with my CFF Dynasty rankings, right? Where I have, how many years they have left, and then just in general, how I view them. Are you a starter? Are you a backup? Are you competing for a starting job? Are you a depth piece? Are you somebody that's just completely buried? Like, I use those categories to help me kind of determine my overall rankings at the end of the day. So totally understand where you're coming from. All right, time to start talking about some of these wide receivers, man. And we'll start with the 2 that you find the most interesting here that you wanted to highlight in this section. You wanted to highlight Joey Hobert and Xavier Restrepo. So we'll start with Hobert, then we'll go to Restrepo. What do you like about, or what do you don't like about Hobert? What do you find interesting about him?
Yeah, going to start with a fun fact. Joey Hobert is the son of Billy Joe Hobert, the starting quarterback of the 1991 national champion Washington Huskies. And Billy Joe Hobert, he was like a big, thick guy, but he could run. He was athletic, and I see it in Joey. I'm like he's a great athlete. I can see the genes from his dad. And Joey, I brought him up because he's a guy that some people are a little more hesitant on. Some people might think that he could have a little regression this year compared to what he did last year. And one of the things that, like, as I look at him, last year, he was the leading receiver. He had a workload of 99 targets, 7 games with 8 targets or more. I'm big on workload. I love seeing that. But then over the last 3 games of the year, Cole Wilson took off. And some people, and that's the hesitancy that some people have about Joey Hobert. I'm not getting hung up on Hobert's bowl game performance. In those last 3 games, when Wilson was really taking off, Joey Hobert averaged 15.9 points per game, 9.6 targets, 77 yards, and 0.6 touchdowns. That's still a healthy stat line when Wilson was going off. Mm-hmm. And so as I kind of look into 2024, I have Hobert projected out at 17.3 points per game. And I do think that there's some wiggle room of how, can he live up to that? Will he be closer to that 15.9 points per game that he had in the final 3 games of last year? But I think maybe the big difference is that he may not have as many targets, but now with Jordan McLeod transferring in from James Madison, they're going to get an upgrade at quarterback. They're going to be able to throw the ball much better than TJ Finley could. And I think you're going to see an increase in his efficiency stats, yards per reception, his touchdown rate. I think those items will go up. And last year, Hobert had 895 yards, 8 touchdowns. So I think even if his reps go down, he might be able to maintain that same yardage and touchdowns based off of the boost that McLeod's going to give them at quarterback. So I don't have a big worry that some people have about Hobert. I think he's definitely a quality guy, like in the top 16, someone that you should look at in the first handful of rounds. And he's in a great offensive system.
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to kind of touch on with Hobert is, one, I don't think people should be worried about Cole Wilson at all, taking away from Joey Hobert. We've seen when G.J. Kinney has this offense going, he'll have 2 top-end wide receivers, especially 2 guys playing on the outside. And Hobert and Wilson, basically, long story short, I think absolutely can coexist. And you even pointed out, like, even while Wilson was going off, Hobert was still doing his thing, right? The other thing that I kind of find interesting here is that Joey Hobert came to Texas State last year as a transfer, right? But he didn't come alone. He came with Craig Stutzman, who's now the offensive coordinator over at San Jose State. And, not conspiracy theory wise, but again, one could theorize that part of the reason why Hobert performed as well as he did was because he had his former coach there as the wide receivers coach, right? Well, now Stutzman's gone. Do you see that potentially impacting Hobert in any kind of way, or do you think G.J. Kinney knows what he's got in Hobert and he's not going to work? Like, there's not going to be much of a beat skip there?
I mean, when looking at coaches, especially if you're talking purely a position coach, I don't know how much of an impact they'll have. The biggest change would be if you're starting to see like a new coordinator and a new emphasis put on like different passing schemes and whatnot, where now the ball's going to other places in the offense. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those where, like I said, during that last 3 games, he was doing just about 16 points a game. I have him projected right above 17. I think somewhere in that range. Like he's still, I think, a safe bet in there. And the thing that I like about him is I still think he has a very safe floor. Mm-hmm. So I'm not too worried about a big drop off. I think it's just going to be that matter of his targets might go down, but I think those efficiency stats with yards and touchdowns should improve and probably balance it out.
All right. What about the other guy you want to talk about here? Xavier Restrepo, the wide receiver out of Miami. It's a quarterback upgrade, hopefully, with Cam Ward here this year. What do you like about him? What do you or don't like about him, or whatever you want to talk about about him?
It is all about volume here. And I have been on him for the whole summer. He is probably a top 5 receiver in my eyes. I actually think he'll finish the year that way. Last year, as a leading receiver, he had 122 targets. So the workload is great. His downfall was he only scored 6 touchdowns. looking into this year, as you mentioned, Cam Ward, upgrade at quarterback, and especially with a big arm that can hit the deep ball, that's going to help the touchdowns go up. It's the second year for offensive coordinator Shannon Dawson. So I've looked at his stats mostly at how I'm viewing these receivers. His career averages for a wide receiver 1 is 122 targets, 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns. Averages. My 2024 projection here is 127 targets, 1,200 yards, 12 touchdowns. A little bit above his averages. And I think the touchdowns is definitely the highest part of this, but I think Cam Ward's going to help solve a lot of that. If you look at the projection that I have laid out for him for this year, which is a little ambitious, but with those stats in a half PPR format, which is how I track my stats, he would have wound up wide receiver 4 overall last year. I don't think it's a huge jump for him to become a top 5 wide receiver. It's all going to come down to the touchdown production. But last year he had 122 targets, career average for Dawson, as coordinator, 122 targets. I've got him projected at 127. I think the yards are going to be there. It's really going to come down to Ward can now push the ball deep, and Restrepo can now burn those coverages and have a quarterback who can get more consistent connections on those deep balls. And that should definitely pump up his touchdown numbers.
I am looking at something real quick before I sound like I'm talking out of my butt here. Because again, you mentioned obviously Shannon Dawson, especially during his time with Dana Holgerson, right? Yeah, you're seeing him. Okay, yeah. So I was about to question. I'm like, was that the slot receiver or the outside wide receiver? And it looks like it is still the slot receiver.
Yeah.
So another point in Xavier Restrepo's favor. Now, the other thing is that with Shannon Dawson, if I recall correctly, in his offensive appearances outside of Dana Holgerson, right, he hasn't been able to replicate that offensive success. Now, given the pieces that he is getting this year out of the portal and with Miami, him being the second year there, this looks like his best chance to be able to do that. So if you think that he can do it, Restrepo is absolutely the guy you have to target here. Right?
I mean, he has the workload. He had the workload last year. The workload lines up with Dawson's career stats. It's just a matter of the yards and the touchdowns catching up. And I don't think that's that big of a leap for, like what you said, they basically bought an offense.
Pretty much. The only thing is, again, he was wide receiver 37 last year. And so, again, he had 6 touchdowns, and you're projecting him for 12. So add 36 points onto what he did last year, doing the quick math in my head. Yeah, that still gets him about the top 15 wide receiver. So regardless, like that's a pretty safe floor as you can expect. And now 12 touchdowns is quite a lot. But
it is. Like I said, it's an ambitious projection, but I am liking it with all those pieces they have.
And in addition, I've kind of pointed this out before. A lot of people talk about, coaching schemes and like how, like which receivers get targeted. But we also got to, I think, pay attention a little bit to what quarterbacks are trained to do, right? Cam Ward just came from Ben Arbuckle's system, who also heavily targeted the slot. And so if Ward still has a lot of those habits still left in him, Restrepo is going to be one of the first guys that he looks to. And so another point in Restrepo's favor. I agree. Restrepo is a guy that I probably haven't gotten enough of this year. He's been like just out of reach in so many of the drafts that I've been looking at recently.
Well, and part of what I look at him in drafts is I think he has a really favorable ADP. You can grab him in the third or even, late second, third rounds in drafts. And I'm viewing him as good as like the top 6 guys here. So he's one of those guys. If I want to go running back heavy in my first 2 picks, and it depends on where you're drafting, but like middle third of the draft, first third of the draft, that's a great spot where you can try and go 2 running backs and then get Restrepo with that third round pick. I think he's a great value. So he's one of those guys I have targeted a lot. I don't know how many shares I have, but that value of like, I think he's as good as someone that's going in the early second round.
All righty, let's move on to my 2 guys here in this tier before we get carried away with ourselves here. I'll talk about our wide receiver 3 here, Tetairoa McMillan, and I'll also talk about our wide receiver 12, Kevin Concepcion. 2 different guys that, again, I've kind of mentioned before, were in that elite tier for me. I've kind of fallen a little bit since then for 2 different reasons, right? McMillan, easily the injury concerns here towards the end. He injured his leg towards the end of spring camp. And, at first we kind of dismissed it, and then Big 12 Media Days kind of came around, and a lot of the language that the coaches and the players were kind of using were not exactly the most glowing about his prospects to returning pretty well. And so a lot of people kind of got doomed and gloom here. Well, now we got more news saying that reportedly he was working on his own on the sideline to start fall camp, but now he has rejoined individual drills and looks good. And according to John Shear of WildcatsAuthority.com, which is the 247 site for Arizona, McMillan, quote, looks like he would play if there was a game this weekend. So, as CFF people, this is the hard part of CFF right now, especially in fall camp, trying to read these tea leaves. Is this a smokescreen by the staff to make it look like McMillan's going to play? I honestly doubt that they're really going to throw up a smokescreen for the likes of New Mexico and Northern Arizona. But even still, like you're trying to figure out, like, all right, how legit is this? Potentially, like, even if he is able to play against New Mexico, it's New Mexico. Are they willing to throw him out there too early, risk it? Boom. All of a sudden you lose two games where he could have absolutely popped off if he was healthy here. So, Joe, the reason why I think McMillan's one of the more interesting guys to discuss right now is because if you knew for a fact he wouldn't miss a single game and he was healthy, he was good to go, he would be the first receiver off of everybody's board pretty much right now. But if he's suddenly missing a game or two, I personally think I'm willing to take that risk, like end of first round, beginning of second round, right? I literally just took him at 2-2 in a best ball draft that we just started up here earlier today. But, Joe, for you, if you knew Tetairoa McMillan was going to miss 2 games here, where would you be willing to take him?
I have him probably in my tier 3 and pretty lower in it, where I've just said I'm not getting him. And that's leaving out the health concerns. There's more statistical and workload concerns that I have. But with the health, I do think it's a genuine issue. I think it'd be one of those things of, you might lose out a little bit if they're like pulling him early from those early games, but you're wanting him to be really going down the stretch in the middle part, help you make the playoffs, help you win the playoffs, where he should still be fine. And they're probably just protecting him and making sure that he doesn't re-aggravate anything. But my other concerns are more so on the workload side.
No, for sure. But like also, again, I've heard this point brought up from people before, right? Of like, well, Brett Brennan hasn't really provided us CFF wide receivers over the last couple of years. And I think it's a very fair point as captain system myself, right? Like I am very sympathetic to that argument. I'm also sympathetic to the argument that Brett Brennan has not worked with a wide receiver nearly as talented as Tet McMillan. And also we haven't seen, literal roommates and best friends from childhood playing on the same team very often. I think that often can trump over what you would normally get out of the system. So I still think he's fine to kind of take the shot on, especially at the end of the first round, where you can really pair him with a lot safer option. Now, granted, the one I took him in, I paired him with Jadon Blue, so you know how safe that is. But even still, like, I'm not going to drop him too much. I'm definitely don't agree with you on him being a tier 3 guy, like, past wide receiver 17. Again, he was a top 7 wide receiver last year. I don't really have much reason to expect that he'll drop out of that too much, considering, again, he still has the same quarterback. Yes, it's a different system, but still got Noah Fifita throwing him the ball. They play in the Big 12, probably the most favorable conference that he could possibly be playing in. So I think he'll still be fine, but worth discussing. The other guy here, Kevin Concepcion, definitely a bigger value to start the season, going kind of mid-second round a lot of times. And people kind of felt like even that was pretty good. Because, again, you're talking about a guy who finished as wide receiver 16 in his true freshman year, right? Problem is, a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was the only thing working on that offense at times. And in addition to his receiving targets, he was getting close to 8 to 10 carries every single game. He was just a guy that they were a Swiss Army knife. They were deploying all over the place. And given what's happened this offseason with the weapons that NC State's brought in, Kevin Concepcion definitely no longer the lone wolf in this offense. In fact, there's even talk recently that Noah Rogers might be the best true receiver on this offense. Now, that might not take away from the fact that KC is probably still the best weapon in general this offense still has. But regardless, there's huge competition here, and I think absolutely we should be discussing the possibility of a pretty big regression here from Concepcion if guys like Noah Rogers, Wesley Grimes, Justin Jolie, even Jordan Waters, the running back, who's a really good receiving back, just multiple options really take away from Kevin Concepcion's ceiling here. Joe, do you kind of agree here?
I do. I remember, I think it was at some point in the spring, the coaches were mentioning that they wanted to lower his overall work, target share. And part of that is because you have these other pieces, you spread the ball around more. Defenses have to be more balanced. They can't, focus in one place or the other. And that would make a lot of sense with the moves that they've made in the portal, the upgrades that they've done. And then also, having a better quarterback with Grayson McCall, I do think will help a little bit. Like I mentioned with Cam Ward, I do think you're going to see a bump in some efficiency stats here, but I have some concern. I do see some regression. It's one of those, I kind of do view T-Mac and Concepcion pretty equally. But if I had to pick one and draft one, I'd actually rather draft Concepcion. I don't think the regression will be that bad.
Okay. No, fair. I could see it. Alrighty. We'll go ahead and, again, I don't think there's really that much more to discuss on Concepcion. Kind of laid out why he could regress pretty well there. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next tier of wide receivers here. Wide receivers 13 through 24. These are typically guys you're probably grabbing as your second wide receivers for your teams and drafts. We'll start off with number 13 here, Sean Atkins, the wide receiver out of South Florida. At 14, we got Brennan Presley, the wide receiver out of Oklahoma State. At number 15, we got Alec Iomenor, the wide receiver out of Stanford. At number 16, we got Rock Taylor, the wide receiver out of Memphis. At 17, we got Derwin Burgess, the wide receiver out of Georgia Southern. At wide receiver 18, we got Deion Burks, the wide receiver out of Oklahoma, formerly of Purdue. At wide receiver... Let's see, I lost track of numbers here. 19, Germie Bernard, wide receiver out of Alabama, formerly of Washington. After that, we got the aforementioned Cole Wilson, wide receiver 2 there at Texas State. At number 21, we got Kyle Williams, the wide receiver out of Washington State. Number 22, we got Jamal Pritchett, the wide receiver out of South Alabama. Number 23, we got Squirrel White out of Tennessee. And number 24, we got Eugene Wilson, the wide receiver out of Florida. So, Joe, once again, we'll kind of get started with your two guys here that you find the most interesting. You identified Deion Burks, the transfer wide receiver from Purdue going to Oklahoma, as well as Kyle Williams out of Washington State. So we'll start with Burks here. What do you want to talk about with Burks?
I'm a little bit on the poo-poo train for Burks. He was the leading receiver for Purdue last year. He was a talented athlete on a poor team. This spring, he explodes in the spring game. 2 big, long touchdowns, looked impressive. One thing that was missing from that spring game was Nick Anderson. Burks was the target on the field. Looking ahead now to this year, I'm not buying the Kool-Aid on Burks being the number 1 receiver. He's got a smaller frame at 5'9". He played on the outside at Purdue, but he's being projected as a slot at Oklahoma. The offensive coordinator, Seth Luttrell, his slot receivers in his coaching career history has been the wide receiver 3 75% of the time. Only once, when a slot was not wide receiver 3, he became the wide receiver 1. So I think that just system-based, Burks in the slot, he's ice skating uphill to be the wide receiver 1.
Yeah, my thing with Burks, I think I'm not down on Oklahoma's offense in general, right? I have Jackson Arnold in my top 10 quarterbacks, right? I love Arnold. I love the weapons that Oklahoma is surrounding himself with. I love the fact that Seth Luttrell was their replacement for Jeff Lebby. I think that you couldn't find a better offensive coordinator replacement there to kind of keep things going while also bringing in his own mix there. But again, we'll touch on this a little bit later when we discuss Nick Anderson a little bit as well. Overall, I'm just not as interested in taking the shots here at wide receiver for Oklahoma, right? I got Deion Burks down here at wide receiver 37 in my rankings here. You can see in our composite rankings, I have he's at wide receiver 18. So clearly we got some guys who are really, really in on him. And I do think part of that was getting bumped up from the bowl game too. I do think that he is very similar to Nick Anderson in the fact that he is a guy that is an explosive playmaker when he is 100%, right? Part of his issue last year at Purdue was that he just wasn't fully in the game, right? Tons of drops, right? Injured, nicked up at times. We never really got to see his full potential there. And I do think Oklahoma, of all places, especially with Seth Luttrell there, is going to unlock that potential. I'm interested in seeing where you got the report that Deion Burks is projected for the slot, because I have also seen that Jalil Farouk has been the name kind of discussed as potentially taking over that slot role from Drake Stoops last year. So
yeah, I've looked at Farouk. It just I've looked at him. The majority of his play has been on the outside as well. So it's one of those, as I kind of look at it, just that 5'9", I think he's 190 pounds. That frame probably fits better in the slot. I'll bring it up with Nick Anderson later, but like Nick Anderson's 6'4". You stick him on the outside.
Yeah, he's going on the outside.
Yeah, so it's one of those it's just trying to look at different sources for depth charts, which is one of the challenges of college fantasy football. They don't post that, especially in the summer. So you're having to try and read tea leaves and look for trends in what you're seeing with information out there. And it just kind of looks to me like I see him probably fitting in the slot a little bit better. I'm forgetting off the top of my head who I was picturing at the other outside, where I think what I was thinking was it was Farouk and one other receiver as the other outside.
Well, I mean, Nick Anderson would be the other outside.
Well, no, I mean Farouk and one other guy contending for the other outside spot, opposite of Anderson.
Well, probably would have been Gibson, but now he's injured. So
yeah, and I think it was Petaway. I think is who I was looking at, like challenging with Burks somewhere in that slot. I just don't have my two deeps in front of me, but that frame, that's kind of where I'm seeing it. But really that Kool-Aid, like he wasn't really being ranked high until the spring game. So like if you want, he's kind of like a Miller Moss. They had one ranking, spring game happened, and a complete flip happened, and it's stayed that way since. I just it's one of those one spring game where a lot of receivers were sitting out hurt. He's going to shine. Who else is there out there?
No, I mean, I agree 100%. I think people definitely went too far the wrong direction with Burks there. Again, I still think that he fits well into this Oklahoma offense, which is part of the reason why he landed here in the first place, right? But I agree with you that, again, there's too much unknown. Again, just in general, I'm not really going for the Oklahoma wide receivers in terms of where their values are at right now. I will ask you, though, if for some reason Burks was put on the outside, right, and it was Farouk that got put in the slot there, would that change your opinion somewhat?
Well, there's two answers to the question that you just asked, which is why I paused. Would I change my mind on my outlook on him versus would I let me rephrase that. Would I change the way that I'm looking at him and possibly draft him where I have been avoiding him in drafts versus adjust the projections rankings? Obviously the projection would adjust, where if he's moving to the outside. But rankings wise, that kind of gets tied in with projections. Drafting, that part of the question, I just think his ADP is too high because of all the Kool-Aid that I like. While I'm being negative on Burks and some other guys that we're going to talk about, I love these guys because let other fantasy owners draft these guys at a high price, and I'm going to find my value later on in the draft. So I think Deion Burks will still serve the same purpose for me of let someone grab Deion Burks instead of a running back, and now I can get the running back I wanted this round. I think he'll still serve that purpose for me in drafts.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, the other guy you wanted to talk about here, Kyle Williams, the wide receiver out of Washington State. What do you want to mention with him?
Yeah, this is an interesting situation. I love the new quote-unquote Mountain West schedule that they have. The real question is who will be the wide receiver one in this offense? Under their head coach, he's a defensive coach, second year at the school, but he's had a wide receiver one be an outside receiver both years he's been there, with two different coordinators. Normally, I kind of don't take note of that with a defensive guy coming in, but I would mostly just focus on offensive coordinators. But it stood out to me because Ben Arbuckle was the coordinator last year. His coaching history before he came into Washington State was the slot receiver as his wide receiver one. That didn't happen last year. Like I said, outside receivers, wide receiver one. So it kind of gets you to start thinking a little bit. And one of the things I kind of look at is why did Arbuckle break from his history? And clearly Williams was the best talented receiver that they had last year. No receiver could really establish themselves in the slot to garnish, more targets. So I think with Arbuckle, it could have been something of, you know what, I'm going to pepper the ball to the best guy I got because he's head and shoulders above everybody else. And that might have been why he broke tendency last year. For this year, Williams is still the best guy on the field. Josh Meredith is the main name for the slot. He's hitting his second season with Arbuckle. So he's got room for a second-year bump, even though he really didn't do anything last year. The key question is can Meredith be good enough this year to dethrone Williams and overtake the wide receiver one spot? Or does Arbuckle just keep saying, Williams is hands down our best guy, I'm breaking from my tendencies and just throwing the ball to the playmaker? Right now, I'm thinking that's probably going to be the case. I think it's too big of a leap to think that Meredith overtakes Williams as a wide receiver one. But it's an interesting situation because of how much it breaks from some tendencies. But luckily, both these guys, Meredith and Williams, they're not going super high in drafts. Williams is still going as the top guy out of Washington State's receiver core. But if with these questions, you're not having to spend too much to get Williams compared to Burks, who we were just talking about. And Williams has a pretty safe floor. So I think he's one of these guys that some people, they might think the moon. I do think there's a little concerns, but one of those, I don't think it's too much. And this is kind of like the Joey Hobert, trying to ease some people if they do have any concerns that, it's going to be Meredith and he's going to take over. I think that's too big of a leap.
I got to push back a little bit on this a little bit, because you kept talking about Williams being the number one wide receiver last year. I mean, one Josh Kelly, also another outside wide receiver, did outproduce him, but also Lincoln Victor, man, 118 targets last year. Lincoln, you said that nobody could establish themselves. Lincoln Victor was the guy. He just got hurt. Right?
Well, that's just over the course of the whole season. Yeah, nobody really stepped up where they were peppering more.
Yeah,
I forget how many games that he played. Yeah,
he played 11 games, but there was a lot. He played hurt in several of those games, especially right there in the middle. I think it was week 4 through, forget which week was their bye week, but week 4 through 6. He played snaps in week 4, didn't do anything. But again, look at these target numbers, right? 19 or 13, 10, 8, gets hurt. Comes back a little bit versus Arizona, 4 targets there. But then Oregon, 19 targets. Arizona State, 11 targets. 14 versus Stanford. 16 versus Cal. The slot's still the guy for Ben Arbuckle.
And that's what he wants to do. Exactly. It's what he wants to do.
And again, Victor getting hurt definitely hurt their plans a lot last year. So the way I talk about this wide receiver room at Washington State, one, I love Kyle Williams. Don't get me wrong here. I think Kyle Williams is fantastic. He is the safer floor of the two wide receivers. Meredith is still your ceiling play out of the two guys, right? And especially now that, again, unfortunately, Carlos Hernandez has gone down with injury. Chris Hudson's moving to the outside. That very much opens up Meredith to being the guy in the slot. Now, Tony Freeman is another name that's kind of popped up recently that has started to get a little bit of buzz. I'm still going with Josh Meredith, although it does sound like he has had a bit of a rough start to the fall camp here. If he's the slot in Ben Arbuckle's office, I'm going to want that regardless, especially in a PPR format, right? So I get what you're saying, but I still think that we don't need to say again, this is a switch to, it's always going to be the wide receiver on the outside that's going to get the love here with Dicker. I still think it's Arbuckle's system that's running here. And especially if you look at last year's, go ahead.
Kind of my takeaway was he broke from his system a little more with Williams just because of how good of an athlete he is. So it's something that does need to at least be kept in mind. Well,
think about it. 2 years before that, right? You had both Jarrett Stearns, but you also had, oh my God, I forgot his name all of a sudden, the outside wide receiver there. He went to Penn State.
I can't think of it.
Oh my God, I should know this off the top of my head. He was phenomenal. Let's see, 2021 stats. I got it here. No, give me wide receivers. Where is he at? Mitchell Tinsley. I knew it started with an M. Mitchell Tinsley. Mitchell Tinsley was a top 20 wide receiver that year as well. So this is completely unheard of for there both to be a top option outside and in the slot. It's just, again, that year, Sturts was the number 1 wide receiver in the country for fantasy versus, Mitchell Tinsley was only top 20. So I still think absolutely room for both Williams and Meredith to pop off this season. You're right. Both of them have really good values right now.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm not being negative on Meredith. It's just one of those, like, I think that is the question looking at it is, does Williams keep getting peppered or does it revert back to the system, which helps Meredith? That was my biggest takeaway viewing the Washington State receiver room.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like, talk about their drafts right now. Williams being drafted as wide receiver 38 in drafts. We have Meredith going all the way down to wide receiver 57. You got to take shots on that system at those prices.
Yeah.
All right, let's hit on my two guys in this range here. I want to talk about Derwin Burgess and Germie Bernard. And with Derwin Burgess, you're going to kind of see a common theme here as I talk about a lot of the different guys here is we assume we have the right guy for the offense. But I as we get closer, I start kind of questioning, like, do we really? Because, again, I like Derwin Burgess. Don't get me wrong. I think he's a talented wide receiver. I know Chris Moxley introduced him to me a couple years ago, and he's had some really, really big games for Georgia Southern. Problem is, like, I look back at his last 2 years. He was wide receiver 78 in 2023, and he was wide receiver 68 in 2022. Now, granted, he got 100 targets in both years. That is something that I like in any wide receiver. If you can get me 100 targets, that's somebody I'm willing to invest in every single time. That's a beautiful floor that I can work with. But the thing I can't get out of my head right now is that his ceiling, unfortunately? Is his ceiling capped because he's not playing out wide in this offense? Meanwhile, or not in the slot in this offense. Meanwhile, Caleb Hood, the last 2 years, was wide receiver 60 in 2022. And the only reason he was that low is because he only got 3 touchdowns that year, which, WTF, what the heck was that about? And then last year, Hood was wide receiver 35, where he got 120. In both years, he got 120 plus targets. So Burgess is going to continue to be on the Z in this air raid offense. And I still think that he is going to be a pivotal part. He'll get his 100 targets again this year. Meanwhile, our 2 slot guys are looking like Dalen Cobb and Josh Dallas. Cobb's the name I've heard the most out of beat reporters' mouths this offseason between the two. I currently have Cobb at wide receiver 67. I've taken plenty of shots at him recently. Kind of similar to what you're talking about with Washington State here, Joe, where we've seen plenty of Clay Helton, right, and this air raid offense. And I start to wonder, is this as system-based as I'm thinking it is, where I'm like, okay, do I just continue to target the slot, or was that just Caleb Hood? Was it just them targeting their best wide receiver? If I think they're going to target their best wide receiver, I have to think they're going to pepper Burgess. But if I think they're going to target their slot, I have to go with a guy like Cobb. So I'm kind of stuck in this place where I'm like, do I just draft both and see what happens in a league? How are you going about Georgia Southern here, Joe?
You're hitting on a lot of the points I had in my notes here. He's the most talented guy, highest fantasy floor. Taking him will not be a bad thing, even at his current ADP. Like if he stays a wide receiver 2 in the offense, he's still a good pick, I think. And as you mentioned, Clay Helton, while at Georgia Southern, it's been the slot with Caleb Hood. Here's the interesting thing: 2018 through 2021, when Clay Helton was at USC, his wide receiver 1 was an outside receiver during that time. So it's one of those questions of what you just said. Did he change and start peppering the ball to Hood in the slot just because Hood was that much better than everybody else? So I think that is a question kind of in the air about Burgess is it going to keep being the slot, or could he revert back to his USC tendencies and throw the ball on the outside for his wide receiver 1? I've liked Cobb all summer. I was a little too high on him at the start, but like he's one of those guys you can go after, in the 20th through 30th round.
I say whenever you want.
Yeah, whenever you want. And so if you're just like, you know what, I'll take a shot in the 25th round. I just don't want someone to steal him from me just in case he's wide receiver 1. You're not paying much of a price. But the price that you're paying for Burgess, I don't think it's that bad, because if he stays where he's at, we know he's reliable. And you're kind of drafting him in the range that he's going to be maybe your wide receiver 3 or 4 on your roster. That's at least where I've seen him going off in drafts. But he has that chance that maybe, hey, they're going to make the outside receiver the wide receiver 1 again. They think he's going to be the best talented guy, and you might see that switch. So he does have potential to make that jump up to wide receiver 1.
Yeah, and I think, again, looking at their values right now, again, Derwin Burgess, wide receiver 23, Dylan Cobb, wide receiver 114. That's what I'm looking at here, right? And so Again, I think it's worth potentially if you want to invest in this offense going after both. And then the other thing I think we have to take into account here is that we don't really know what tendencies we're going to get out of the quarterback here.
Yeah.
Right. JC French, relatively unknown. We saw him play a little bit last year, but for the most part, it was like wildcat packages, right? They used his legs a lot. They didn't really ask him to throw the ball a ton. Dexter Williams is a complete, not unknown. We know he's pretty rough around the edges. So is that a guy that can get the ball to the outside wide receiver pretty consistently like you would want to see? Who knows? Maybe this offense completely falls apart this year because they can't get good quarterback play. I don't know. But for right now, I think it, again, definitely worth an eye. If you can find good beat reporters for Georgia Southern, I think it's worth keeping an eye, kind of figuring out where the buzz is between those guys. The other receiver I want to talk about in this range is Germie Bernard. Bernard is a guy that's been steadily creeping up my rankings pretty much all off season. And I typically don't love going after transfers, but like everything's pointing Bernard's way for Alabama, right? You got a great system here. Kalen DeBoer has been consistent with his wide receivers pretty much as long as he's been a coach. We are looking at Alabama, who should have the talent to steamroll most of their competition and be pretty much locked in for 40 points a game with this offense. In addition, Germie knows this system. He was with DeBoer at Washington, right? And he looked pretty solid last year after Jalen McMillan went down. In addition, we got a very shallow wide receiver room here. We got Kobe Prentice. He's fine. Kendrick Law being your third starting wide receiver is a little rough, in my opinion, especially for a program like Alabama. Besides those two, the fact that Caleb Odom, who was a transition tight end going to wide receiver here, is playing second string should tell you about the depth they feel like they have at wide receiver. And the fact that Ryan Williams, who arrives this fall, not in the spring, this fall, is already being projected by multiple beat reporters as a potential starter, speaks to what they're dealing with at the position, which really makes Germie Bernard stand out all the more. In addition to the fact that he had a great spring, he looked phenomenal during the spring game in the run that he did get. It's one of those things where, again, I'm looking at him, looking at my rankings here. I got him wide receiver 19. He's wide receiver 19 in the consensus here for us. And part of me sitting here wondering, like, should I just go more all in? Because there's not really much pointing away from him not having a good season. What do you think, Joe?
The one thing I like the most about him is his ADP value. You can get him. I don't have the number in front of me, but I'm going to guess, what is he, 5th, 6th round ADP?
Looking at the ADP here, Germie Bernard is currently going wide receiver 22, 55.1. So you're looking at middle of the 5th round there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can get a guy here that has the potential to be really good in the 5th round. He's another guy like Restrepo. These are like value guys that I like to target. I have one slight concern, but this is one of these where you start getting into talent, which you were covering, versus system, and there's not like a clear answer on it. But like last year, you kind of have to forget about Rone Odunze's season last year. He played on the outside. He was a wide receiver 1, but from 2019 at Indiana through 2022, the wide receiver 1 for Kalen DeBoer has been a slot receiver. And Bernard played a balanced mix last year, both outside and inside. So one of those questions is, are they going to keep him on the outside? Are they going to move him into the slot? Kobe Prentice, I keep seeing him listed as being the slot starter. And it's, if you have that, it's one of those, like, I don't have a lot of faith in saying, I think Kobe Prentice is, I'm not going to plant my flag calling him wide receiver 1, but he's at least playing in the spot that historically does. So that could take away some of the shine off of Bernard, but still, even if Bernard's a like super close wide receiver 2 in the offense, I still think he's going to be very good, and you're not paying 2nd, 3rd round price to get him. So it's one of those, I kind of lean with you on the talent end. If I had to make a bet, I'd say I'd bet on him being wide receiver 1, but there is that little bit of just recognizing, like, if I'm going to target someone else, I'm going to target whoever's in the slot, like late in the draft, if I'm targeting someone from Alabama, just because of that, his history with DeBoer. Like I said, you got to ignore Rome Odunze last year. and when you focus on that, it's always been the slot guy.
So again, this is something I'm starting to play around with a little bit, but you know, getting the guy in the historically productive position in a system is obviously great for CFF. You know what potentially could be even greater? The guy that they know how to move around and get mismatches, and they create mismatches for. Bernard, like you said, it kind of played a very balanced role last year at Washington. They already know that offensive staff. They already know how to get mismatches with him already. And if he's that good and the rest of the room is not as great, they're going to find ways to get him the ball, whether it's in the slot, whether it's on the outside, whether it's lining up in line. Maybe they do something crazy like that, or line him up in the backfield. Whatever they're going to do, that's the kind of guy that could really end up exploding. And so I think it's another reason to like Bernard.
Yeah, people don't realize he ran the ball 14 times last year for 2 touchdowns and was a kick returner at Washington.
Yep.
So he is kind of a Swiss Army knife. Why I say, if I'm going to bet on something, I'll bet on his talent. It's not a safe bet betting on Prentice's talent right now, but so that's why I'm in agreement with you. I like the talent end of it, and they could just kind of do. DeBoer could do what they did with Adunze last year and just be like, hey, he's our best, and we'll move him around a little bit. He might play on the outside, but the fact that he played balance, they could just say, we'll just move him to the slot. That's where we want to go anyways. He's played some inside, and they might just do that. So he has that capability.
No, for sure. All right, last tier of wide receivers we'll discuss here, wide receivers 25 through 36. At 25, we got Kiren Lacy, the wide receiver out of LSU. At 26, we got Noah Smith out of Sam Houston. At 27, we got Emeka Egbuka, the wide receiver out of Ohio State. At 28, we got Jaden Higgins, the wide receiver out of Iowa State. At number 29, we got Rashad Owens, the other wide receiver out of Oklahoma State. Number 30, we got Josh Kelly out of Texas Tech, formerly of Washington State. At number 31, we got Malachi Fields, the wide receiver out of Virginia. Number 32, we got Trey Harris out of Ole Miss. At 33, we got Colin Lacey, formerly of South Alabama, now at Louisville. At number 34, we got Travis Hunter out of Colorado. At number 35, we got Isaiah Bond, the wide receiver formerly of Alabama, now at Texas. And rounding out our top 36 is Kobe Hudson, the wide receiver out of UCF. Joe, the two guys that you identified in this range are Kiren Lacy and Emeka Egbuka. Tell me, real quick, why you find both of those guys interesting in this range.
Yeah, I brought them up as interesting because I'm going to be a negative Nancy here. I think both are probably going to be a letdown compared to how high people are viewing them and how high they're being drafted. I'll start with Emeka Egbuka. First thing I'm going to tell everybody that's watching, forget what you know about Ohio State wide receivers and what you've seen the last handful of years. With Ryan Day, the wide receiver one was averaging 18 points per game since 2018 in a half PPR. But as we mentioned, Chip Kelly's coming. I don't think Chip Kelly took this job if he had to run somebody else's offense. That they're going to be running his system. And when I look at his numbers, it's not good for wide receivers. For Chip Kelly since 2018, wide receiver one has averaged 11.4 points per game. He prefers a slot receiver as his wide receiver one and an outside or balanced receiver for wide receiver two. I think this is going to be a big letdown. And I think some people don't expect 2023, 2022 type numbers from Ohio State receivers, but I don't think they realize how big of a drop. Career average of 18 points a game to a career average of 11.4. That's a big drop off. Egbuka plays a balanced mix of both outside and inside last year, which would line up with wide receiver two under Chip Kelly's offense. Brandon Inniss is the slot guy who normally is the wide receiver one. And I picture him staying there. So it's like, if Egbuka's staying on the outside or in that kind of balanced mix, and he's a wide receiver two under Chip Kelly. Chip Kelly's wide receiver two averages 6.8 points per game. That's awful.
So I highly doubt that if they're looking to get their best players on the field, that involves moving Egbuka outside the slot. You're going to have Cardinal Tate, you're going to have Jeremiah Smith on the outside there. Based on what we're hearing out of camp, Jeremiah Smith will be starting for Ohio State this year. The one thing I can kind of push back on with Chip Kelly is that, again, it's a similar thing to Brent Brennan at Arizona, right? Where, yes, typically you're not looking at him getting high wide receiver value here. He also may not have ever worked with a wide receiver room quite like this. So that could also break his tendency there a little bit. And I don't think it's going to be quite as doom and gloom as wide receiver 1 is going to get 11 point, what was it, 11.7, 11.2?
11.4 is the average. So that's the middle ground. Yeah, that's the middle ground. But still, it's like it's a big gap to go from 11 points to 18, what people have been used to.
Oh, for sure. But again, like, even if Egbuka is getting here, 15, 16 points, I don't think it's going to be quite as drastic as going down to 11 points there. I do think that there's going to be some level of mixing between Ryan Day's philosophy and Chip Kelly's philosophy here as well, right? So I don't think it's going to be quite as drastic with him. And again, I'll talk about it a little bit later, that I do think that there's still going to be some value here in Ohio State's wide receiver room. Because even when their offense wasn't great last year, right? Marvin Harrison is still a top 5 wide receiver. Now, granted, 1, talented, top 4 pick in the NFL draft. 2, he was the only thing working at times last year, right? So they had to force feed him the ball. But also, like, if you're worried about, like, maybe this offense isn't running nearly as much, or these wide receivers aren't going to get as many touchdown opportunities, if one guy breaks out from this team, I do think that they're going to still find ways to get them the ball. And again, given the fact that Egbuka came back for another year when he could have gone in the first round of the NFL draft this past year, if not a high second round pick, I doubt that similar to, I talked about this with Trayvon Henderson last year. I'm like, I doubt that their pitch to him was, we're going to bring in a new offensive coordinator that's going to get you the ball less, right? I think that they're bringing him back. They're like, you're going to be the number 1 guy. We're going to rely on you. You should be fine for the most part. Will he reach the heights of wide receivers of the past for Ohio State? Probably not. But will it be, crash and burn here? I don't think so. What about Kiren Lacy?
Yeah, so this is one, and this kind of goes into what we're talking about of like historical averages. And there's something that I call fantasy ceilings. So take a player or take a particular coach, and let's just say they're starting quarterback. And you can look at every single season they've had one. What was the highest scoring year? And I call that the fantasy ceiling. Like, okay, here's what we know is the best that's ever happened under this coach. And when you look at this LSU offense, I spent a lot of time looking at them this offseason. You have to forget about last year. I really think you have to do that because the numbers were just insane. I've never seen numbers like this. Before. So let's imagine we're 1 year in the past. It's 2022 right now, or excuse me, it's 2023, and we're looking back at 2022 and further back history numbers. The best that you saw for points per games, the fantasy ceilings for both Brian Kelly and Mike Denbrock, the best that you saw was wide receiver 1, 16.5 points. Wide receiver 2, 8.7 points for their career histories. If you count out 2023. That was the best. So this isn't an average. This is the ceiling. You look now at what they did last year, the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2, and you compare that to those ceilings. Wide receiver 1 performed at 133% of that fantasy ceiling, and the wide receiver 2 at 224%. This is, like, in my opinion, kind of the equivalent of you just happen to win the lottery. Like don't bank on this. Don't make your whole investment strategy around winning the lottery. But that's kind of the way I feel. The more I looked at the numbers and compared it to their past, it was just like it was that combination of you had the right coaches, the right skill players, you had an amazing Heisman winning quarterback, and they just put up PlayStation numbers. I just can't see anything close to that happening this year. I think you're going to see a little bit more of a regression back to what you've seen from the coaches that we have here. And the biggest trouble I see is that you got so many talented guys, like who's really going to jump out? And it's a big guessing game. Like for me, it's you go into draft, like, is it going to be Lacy? Is it going to be CJ Daniels? It's going to be Chris Hilton. It's going to be Xavier Thomas. I've just kind of taken an approach of, if I know there's going to be a big regression, and there's no solid answer, who's wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, I've just kept out of it. And that's been my view on Lacy. I think he probably has the best bet to be the top receiver. But when you start looking at ADP values tied with all these question marks and the possibility of a really big correction, that's just been the main point I wanted to get out there was, I'm just staying away from the LSU passing game this year because I think the expectations are too high and that's driving ADP prices up too much.
So a couple of points here that I'll bring up, just playing a little devil's advocate here, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned the history of the coaching staff, right? And like clearly, you're right. When you have a season like that that's just completely bonkers compared to the rest of them, mm-hmm. that has to raise up a red flag of some kind. Mm-hmm. But here's the other thing, right? A lot of times, coaches learn from that, right? They realize, like, all right, what I was doing before didn't work. What we did last year did work, and you're 100% right. A lot of that has to do with the exact combination of players. I mean, shoot, they had 2 first-round NFL wide receivers last year. That's a huge part of the reason why Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas had the year they had last year, because they were just so damn talented, right? But that doesn't mean that they can't then try to take what they learned from that scenario and try to bring that out of the guys they do have now, right? Mm-hmm. Kiren Lacy is a guy that I think can kind of replace that Malik Neighbors role. I'm not saying replace Malik Neighbors' talent, but if people thought that Kiren Lacy was going to be this one-to-one, replacement for Neighbors here, he'd be going as high as a guy like Emeka Egbuka, Eugene Wilson, like these guys that are going in wide receiver 12 to 15 range. He's going all the way down to wide receiver 25 range. Like people, I think, agree with you on some level. There's going to be a regression here. There has to be. That was video game numbers they were putting up last year. I just personally think that if you're going to believe that they're going to be able to not replicate that offense, but still have a very productive offense, especially if you're a believer in Garrett Nussmeier, you have to be okay with taking a shot on Kiren Lacy. Who's he going to throw to? I think Lacy's probably the most locked-in starter out of the bunch. Those outside guys that are really where the more competition is. Like you mentioned, Xavier Thomas, C.J. Daniels, Chris Hilton. Chris Hilton's getting a lot of praise right now. I've been taking him late. But I think that the regression's kind of baked in with a lot of this, right? You're Kiren Lacy, wide receiver 25. That's people's third wide receiver. Sometimes second wide receiver, I would say that's probably a little too rich. But if you're getting him as your third wide receiver and you're kind of hoping he's that home run hit after you grab 2 safer guys ahead of him, I think it's perfectly fine in my opinion.
And I think you have to adjust how you view Lacy and these receivers based on, are you purely doing a best ball? Or are you doing like a season long? You're actually making lineups and doing transactions. So like for me, what I like about this team, if I'm like in a redraft, is I'm going to let some other people spend higher capital in this situation. I'll focus on other receivers that I think are in more solid situations, good systems as well. Just try and get the most value out of my draft picks. But then I'm going to every one of these guys that's not drafted. Or even if they are drafted, I'll probably just put all of them on a favorite list on Fantrax.
True.
And just I'm going to keep my eye out. And so they're going to be like guys I'm going to target in the waiver wire, wait for someone to drop one of them. In a best ball, that's where you're just going to kind of take your shots. I think part of the problem is some of them are going like Lacy goes too early in a draft for where I'm drafting receivers, where I'm willing to take enough risk compared to other guys that I see where I'm just like, I just kind of prefer what I'm seeing stability here that I want in the top half of my receiver core. And I'll loosen up a little bit on the stability and shoot for upside in that second half. But especially some of these other names, if it's a best ball, you're around 20 plus, like if they're still there, like shoot your shot. I agree with that part.
Mm-hmm. All righty. Move on to my 2 guys in this range, and 2 guys that I haven't really talked a ton about this offseason. Again, that's part of the reason why I like doing these crash courses, because it kind of forces me to talk about some guys that for the most part have kind of flown under the radar. And the 2 guys I'll talk about here, Jaden Higgins, wide receiver out of Iowa State, and then Josh Kelly, the former Washington State wide receiver, now going to Texas Tech there. Higgins I'm bringing up because, again, I kind of find myself not really investing a ton in this Iowa State offense, even though I can fully admit that I like the pieces that are involved here, right? I do have the occasional Abu Sama share, but between Higgins and Noel, I just find myself not really drafting either of those 2, and I kind of started asking myself the question of why. Well, one, I poo-pooed Rocco Beck's value a couple of weeks ago, right, where he's going top 36 running quarterbacks, and I just really don't see the path there for him returning that value. But then 2, between Higgins and Noel, right, I think it's a hard web to untangle here between the 2 of these guys in terms of which one's going to be the one you target in drafts, right? Now, Higgins clearly is the guy that people are drafting higher than Noel here. And if you look at their finishes last year, Higgins actually finished lower at wide receiver 97. Noel is at wide receiver 71. Noel finished the year with 92 targets across regular and postseason. Higgins was at 80. Higgins had the absolute monster bowl game, though, right? 13 targets, 214 yards, and a touchdown there. That's probably partially why people are so excited about him. But there's other things here, right? One, I think there's three main reasons why people are kind of more in on Higgins than Noel. One, did more with less last year. He had 80 targets, 18.5 yards per reception, while Noel was averaging only 12.4. Two, Noel's been in this system longer, which is a point in his favor, but he's going into his fourth year. And while he has improved each year, I feel like people are almost kind of tired of waiting. They feel like they know his ceiling and it's capped at what he was able to do last year just because of the role he has in this offense. Meanwhile, Higgins, in his first year in this system, almost put up 1,000 yards and now has another offseason to really solidify himself within that system. Three, people are thinking of Xavier Hutchinson. If you're chasing the Xavier Hutchinson explosion, if you're chasing, like you said, that kind of ceiling play for what Matt Campbell can do with his offense here, you're targeting the outside guy in this offense. And that's where Higgins is playing while Noel hangs out in the slot. So personally, I don't have either of these guys, or I don't have Higgins as high as wide receiver 28. But what do you kind of think about the situation at Iowa State, Joe? Are you somebody who's big on Higgins? He's like the clear-cut guy over Noel. Do you think these guys are more even? What do you think?
Just running the projections on the two, if I just take all emotions out of it and just run the numbers, the final fantasy points came out pretty even between the two. I think in my draft guide, they might be right next to each other, honestly. But obviously the way that their numbers get distributed is very different. And like you hit on a lot of the points I was going to bring up, but Noel, he's had his year 2 bump where we should see that jump up in production. So it looks like he probably has hit his ceiling, or if he has any room, there's not much. It's just a small amount of room left to hit his ceiling. Whereas Higgins, he's gonna be going into year 2 bump, and I don't think you have to spend that high of a price to get Higgins. I think the problem is just Iowa State passing game's not sexy. I think that's part of why you and I don't think I have any shares of them. Just it doesn't get people excited like LSU offense, what we just talked about. LSU offense gets people excited. Iowa State does not when it comes to passing. So I think that's probably the one thing that does hinder them. And there are some very savvy drafters out there who are just like, I don't care. I'll take Higgins. Like I said, I like it when people draft someone that I think's too high so it can open up other players for me. And I've kind of noticed that doing mock drafts this summer that there's some savvy players who are like, yeah, chase the flashy names, give me Higgins around this spot, and so I do think he definitely can be a good fit, and especially someone that you think gives you reliability and the possibility of a high upside. There's not a lot of players that give you both of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and again, I finally found their ADP. I couldn't find them for a second here, but yeah, Higgins, wide receiver 33, beginning of the 9th round is his ADP. Meanwhile, Noel goes at the end of the 13th round, so 13-11 is typically where he goes, wide receiver 54. So between those two values, Joe, how would you kind of react to that?
I mean, I would say, if I'm betting on one of the two, I bet on Higgins because you got that upside. And they're both established. So I could take either one of them in the 9th round. I would feel comfortable taking them there because I feel like they've established themselves enough where I'm looking for some reliability at that point in my receiver roster. But with Higgins, he's got that upside. I think his ADP is probably spot on. I think he's probably exactly where he should be. I just think too many people avoid him. And then you probably have a handful of people that are just the same people drafting him over and over. It's just kind of,
I can see it.
Yeah.
All right. The other wide receiver I talked about in this range, again, Josh Kelly, former Washington State wide receiver. Last year was wide receiver 33 with the Cougars, now at Texas Tech here. Kind of similar to previous discussions I've had here. I want to make sure we have the right guy here at Texas Tech. Kelly easily getting drafted ahead of all the other guys at Texas Tech, because behind him is a little bit of a cluster bunch in terms of who's really going to step up there. Everybody seems pretty set on the fact that Kelly's going to be one of the guys starting for this offense. And obviously there's things to like here. It's nice seeing Kelly transferring to a very similar system that he was playing at with Washington State. You have to think that when he transferred out, Ben Arbuckle was like, hey, go play for Kitley over there at Texas Tech. He gets you in the Power 4, and you don't even have to learn a new system or anything like that, right? But as I kind of mentioned before, outside of Kelly, there's quite a bit of competition here, right? Coy Eakin, Micah Hudson, Dre McCray hanging around, and some other guys that kind of pop off here and there. Now, this wide receiver room also did clear out of a lot of the mess that had been kind of logging things the last couple of years. But then the other point we kind of brought up earlier, right? Since Ben Arbuckle and Zach Kitley split, we haven't seen Zach Kitley really target that slot like he did back at Western Kentucky and Houston Baptist. But there's this, this thought in your head that he still isn't running the system he really wants to at Texas Tech. He hasn't had consistent quarterback play, one, just because of health, but also two, because of just consistency from them in general, right? And so you have this kind of thought in the back of your head that, yes, technically the outside wide receiver position the last couple of years with Jaron Bradley has been the guy who gets targeted the most, and that should benefit Kelly this year. But the problem is, what if things do take off this year? What if Baron Morton's healthy this entire year? What if he takes a big step forward this year? Does a guy like Coy Eakin, Dre McCray, Micah Hudson, any of those guys potentially playing in the slot there, does that suddenly become the value for CFF while most people drafting Josh Kelly are kind of stuck with that potentially high floor but very low ceiling play there? So, Joe, how do you kind of navigate this Texas Tech wide receiver room right now? Do you think Kelly's still the best guy to really target there?
I mean, it's one of those. If you had to bet $5 right now, who would you put that $5 on? For me, Kelly would be where I'd lean. But yeah, I don't feel great. I like his upside for all the stuff that you mentioned. The biggest note I had, I think it's the biggest question, is how's the quarterback play going to be with Morton? And what I have here, Morton is going to be Kelly's anchor or launch pad. That's the way I'm kind of viewing really any of these receivers.
That's a great way to phrase it.
Yeah. I mean, he's going to be the anchor or the launch pad for him. And I don't have an answer to that. It's one of those things, I've identified the issue. I don't know the answer. And that's the way I kind of feel about how Morton's going to come into this. And Kelly's a guy I don't think I've drafted once, but I wouldn't mind drafting him. He's someone I would take a shot on. But it's like you said, there's a little bit of this, would Kitley maybe want to go back to looking at a slot receiver? So you got to keep peppering on the outside. Does somebody else step in? I do picture, though, they said at the beginning, Josh Kelly was told, hey, I know exactly where you need to transfer. Go there. You're going to be a star. You're going to fit in perfect in their system.
All righty. Well, that kind of covers our top 36 wide receivers here. We have to move through this last part pretty quickly. What we'll do here again, we'll go through some guys that we think are being drafted too high. I'm going to go through all three of my guys here, Joe, and then I'll give you a chance to react to that, and then I'll let you talk about your three guys that you think are being drafted too high, and I'll react to that. But we'll kind of go through these pretty quickly here. My three wide receivers that I think are being drafted too high: Eugene Wilson, Nick Anderson, and Trey Harris are the three that I kind of put up here. Eugene Wilson's probably, out of these three, probably my softest fade. Out of the three, again, I have him at wide receiver 28. ADP has him at wide receiver 17. I just am very queasy about the idea of drafting Eugene Wilson as a wide receiver 2 right now. The argument really for him is that he's going to make a huge step up in this year too, right? But when you look at what he did do in 10 games last year, to me, there are a couple of things here that are a little concerning. One, 8.9 yards per catch. You're not talking about a super explosive guy. There's a lot of low ADOT targets here that he couldn't really turn into bigger gains. Speaking of bigger gains, 0 100-yard games out of all the games that he played last year. Now, this isn't like the end of the world for a freshman or anything like that, but for people who are like projecting and saying like, oh, like we haven't seen the ceiling yet. I'm like, yeah, we haven't seen the ceiling yet, but like, are you sure the ceiling's there? Because we haven't seen it like that huge performance from him yet. 8.2 targets per game after the bye week last year. That's a pretty solid amount, but it's not anything that I'm like riding home to, because if you extrapolate that over 12 weeks, then it gets you to 98.4 targets over 12 games, which is close to my 100 target mark. So I love that for the most part. But with his low efficiency numbers, if that stays the same as he did last year, right, he's going to need more than 100 targets in order to be CFF relevant, right? And you would think like, okay, great. Pearsall's gone. He was the number one target last year. that should open things up for Wilson this year. Well, they bring in Elijah Badger, who will also pretty much take right over that similar role that Pearsall was playing in last year. They also bring in Shimray Dike, the former Wisconsin wide receiver who played with Graham Mertz back in Wisconsin there. To me, that's two legit targets that Wilson's going to have to compete against there. It just seems a little bit more than I want to see from our wide receiver 2 on my fantasy roster to overcome. So again, fading Wilson a little bit there. I still like him. Obviously, the talent's there, but I just think that there's more obstacles than people are kind of giving credit for there. Nick Anderson's my other fade here. Wide receiver 31 in ADP. I got him wide receiver 68. I probably could bump him up a little bit because, again, there is a talent there. He's a very explosive guy. But last year, we almost got a best-case scenario in terms of this passing game for Oklahoma. Yes, Seth Littrell, I mentioned earlier, I love the fact they brought him in here. But even still, like with Jeff Levy and everything, they still spread the ball around a little bit here. And there's not really a ton of room for multiple guys to succeed well here. Stoops was wide receiver 22 on the year last year. He played in the slot. Nick Anderson, the aforementioned here, wide receiver 70, and Jalil Farouk was wide receiver 152 because he only got like 2 touchdowns on the year. It was a rough year for Jalil Farouk here. Nick Anderson's a deep threat option in this offense. He's going to have some monster games throughout the year because of that ability to get those high volume targets. Dude averaged over 20 yards per catch last year. He's going to be great for best ball. Not somebody I want to plug in at his current ADP in a redraft format as my wide receiver 3 in those formats. Because last year, again, I mentioned he was second on the team in fantasy points, but he was third on the team in targets last year. One of those guys who out-targeted him returns in Jalil Farouk. Now, granted, I don't think Jalil Farouk's the most talented guy in the world, and I do think Anderson could step up here. But in addition, we mentioned earlier, Deion Burks comes in as well. Again, we have differing opinions on whether Burks will be the number 1 guy or not, or like to what extent that will be. But regardless, like he's going to have some competitions on that outside, whether it's Jalil Farouk or Deion Burks, right? If he kind of gets stuck in that position again, where he's only getting like 60 to 70 targets again, that's great that he could potentially get those high volume targets, but it's still going to keep that ceiling down, right? Again, even in a best case scenario last year where he got 60 targets, 20 yards plus per catch, and 10 touchdowns, he still only finished as wide receiver 70. The big thing for him will need to be he has to have the number of targets increased by a pretty substantial margin. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Seth Littrell typically targets those outside guys there. That could be your way to getting there. But I think with Burks coming in, with Jalil Farouk returning again, I don't think that is quite crystal clear, especially when you have to rely on him getting 10 touchdowns again on that limited target share. I don't think you can really rely on that. Last receiver here is Trey Harris. If you want a more in-depth reason as to why I'm really out on Trey Harris, again, I got him at wide receiver 55. ADP has him at wide receiver 18. Go listen to the pod I did with Nate a couple weeks ago in terms of just like guys that are going way too high. I fully broke down Trey Harris there, but basically I'll make it quick here. This boils down to me believing that people are buying too much into a few massive games Harris had last year, and them thinking that the only reason why he had bad games was because he got hurt. Guys, he played 11 games. And there was no pattern to his production last year. There's no period you could look over the season and be like, oh, well, weeks 5 through 8, those are the weeks he hurt, and then he got right back on track once he was healthy. No, it was up and down the whole season. Like looking at some of these games, his massive game, obviously week 1, 4 touchdowns against Mercer. Okay, fine, whatever. LSU 2 weeks later, that was another big game. You would think, okay, he can replicate that against Arkansas the next week. Nope, 1 catch, 26 yards. And then you're like, oh, well, he's out again. Auburn, 4 catches, 102 yards. You're like, okay, maybe I'm back in. Nope, Vanderbilt, who he should have destroyed. 6 catches, 67 yards. And you're like, all right, I'm out on him. Goes up against Texas A&M, a good defense in the SEC. 11 catches, 213 yards, and a touchdown. And then you're like, all right, I'm back in. And then he has a 0 100-yard games the rest of the season. And guys, there's no, oh, he was hurt this week or hurt during this period or not. It's just inconsistent production. And you cannot, in my opinion, take that in a redraft format. Maybe in best ball, you can convince me to go up a little bit higher, but in a redraft format, no way am I counting on that week to week. So those are my 3 guys there between Eugene Wilson, Nick Anderson, and Trey Harris. Varying degrees in terms of how much I'm fading them. Joe, your reaction to those 3?
Yeah, I'm going to go in the opposite order you went in, like with Trey Harris here. I agree with you. Very streaky play. I looked at it. He only had 6 games with more than 6 targets last year. So if you're wanting volume, maybe you're getting half a season out of it. The biggest concern I have with really anyone but Jackson Dart on Ole Miss is that I think Lane Kiffin went and acquired as much talent as he can.
Yep.
And he's going to rotate guys through. He's going to keep them healthy, and he's going to make a push for the playoffs. So, him getting a bunch of targets, it might be difficult because he's just going to rotate receivers more. Antoine Wells, I think, is another one who's going to eat into his ability. They're both outside receivers, which are targeted in this offense. My projections between Harris and Wells, they only differ by 9 targets, 100 yards, and 1 touchdown. I see them like I said, I just kind of see spreading the wealth out of this Ole Miss offense. And I'm with you. I just think he is too high of a price. He's one of those guys where it's like, I wouldn't mind him in a best ball format, but I just don't want to pay that price for him. Nick Anderson's someone I'm a little higher on than you. The main point you brought up, and it fits in a lot of things that I had here, high touchdowns off of low workload. A lot of that goes into that big 6'4" frame. Maybe this year with a young quarterback, when they want to pass it in the end zone, they're just going to throw a bunch of rebounds to him. That might help him keep his touchdowns up. But I do think that the overall low workload is one concern. And then, like you said, too, just kind of a lot of moving pieces there that aren't clear. Whereas like Ole Miss, we have clear pieces. We just don't know exactly how they're going to be divvied up. But here with Oklahoma, I agree with you. It's tough to say. And then with Eugene Wilson is a guy, I'm in that frame of mind. We should see a year 2 bump. I do like him, thinking that he's going to be a little more stable. But like you said, like he's not a ceiling play. He's going to be a stability play. Like for me, I'd have no problem getting him as like a wide receiver 2 or 3 because I'm typically favoring running backs. And when I'm looking at my top 3 receivers, I just want someone who I feel like will be reliable, and I'm not thinking ceiling. So I do like Wilson through that mindset.
All right, let's look at your 3 guys here. Joe, for those who are watching on YouTube, you've known for a while who he's going to discuss, but you got Kiren Lacy out of Louisville, LeJontay Wester out of Colorado, and Jamal Pritchett out of South Alabama as your guys going too high. I'm letting you know right now, you're not going to get much argument from me on all 3 of these guys. So load it up, man.
Yeah, I mean, Kiren Lacy, G5 to P4 transfer guy. Wide receiver is the best position for someone to make that move. But the main concern I have is he's probably going to be in the wrong position in the offense. If he stays in the slot, it doesn't fit well with Jeff Brom's offense. Wide receiver 1 has typically been outside. Wide receiver 2 has typically been outside. Wide receiver 3 is where he has that slot/balance type player. And the wide receiver 3 over Brom's statistical, career history here averages 7.4 points per game. It's not a high upside, so targeting someone on the outside is a lot better. I'm a little higher on Lacy. I'm projecting him out at 11.6 points per game in a half PPR. So I am kind of recognizing some of his talent, but at the price he's going at, I don't want to touch him. I'd rather wait till later in the draft, go after either outside receiver or both. I think like
no reason you can't do both.
Yeah, exactly. There's no reason you can't do both. It's just a much better pick where I'd rather go after someone that gives me more stability and better upside at the price that Lacy's going at. For Wester, this is another one kind of like Ole Miss. I think there's just too many toys to play with in that Colorado wide receiver room. Another G5 to Power 4 transfer from Florida Atlantic. He was great last year. He was right around, I think, wide receiver 4 last year in a half PPR. But he plays the slot. So you're bringing in a guy that you're going to expect, okay, he should, we're not going to just bring him in and he's sitting on the bench, but last year's starter, Jimmy Horn in the slot, is still there. Mm-hmm. So that's one little thing that kind of raises some concern. We don't have a really big data sample on Deion Sanders and what's going to happen with this offense. So it's tough to say, you can only say the slot wide receiver was wide receiver 3 last year. I think that's the depth of what you can say about that. I think Travis Hunter and Will Shepard are more talented and they're going to get more targets than Wester will. And so like for me, I'm just like, for an 8th round pick for a guy that probably is wide receiver 3, I can't spend that value on him. And then my last guy with Jamal Pritchett, I'm going to admit this is a little bit of splitting hairs. So I do like Pritchett for what we talked about. Like if you're looking for a more established receiver, I think he has the highest fantasy floor of anybody on this team. The 4th round ADP is one of those that I don't mind spending in Applewhite's offense. So it's one of those that it's still a high price, but like, 4th round ADP equates to about a wide receiver 1 or 2 on your roster, just depending on how you go. You probably still wouldn't be drafted if it was volume picks. But you got Devin Boyson. He's coming back from injury. He's going to challenge for targets on the outside. One of the other issues that I'm really seeing here is Gio Lopez. I don't want to get too hung up on no completions in the spring game, but it's one of those, like, is he just kind of a, Burt Emanuel running quarterback that you have to set up easy throws for? For a negative, even if Lopez is playing halfway decent, like he might pull Pritchett down a bit for his value. If Boyson doesn't take over, if everything goes right for Pritchett, Lopez could be an anchor that drags down his value. So I do see his numbers taking a bit of a dip. He's someone I drafted, I think, in the first half of the summer, and I've laid off as the summer's gone on. And it really just comes down to that 4th round price for me. If I could get him in the 6th, I'd take him every draft. But that 4th round just kind of becomes really difficult.
Yeah, I'll do the same thing as you. I'll start with the bottom guys and kind of go up, because Pritchett's the one, again, out of these guys, he's probably my softest fade of these 3 guys. Again, I agree with you 100% on just the issues that could potentially arise with that South Alabama offense. Boyson coming out and showing everybody what we thought he would be last year. And again, like, he's being taken as wide receiver 21 in ADP. My rank is wide receiver 27. Some people might think like, oh, that's not a huge gap and everything, right? ADP wise, that's a good 24 picks between the two of them. So that's almost an additional 2 rounds. So it is a pretty substantial gap there. But for the most part, again, of these 3 guys, I think Pritchett's the most fine. Wester, I agree with you 100%. I do think that Wester probably still has a better shot at being wide receiver 1 than you're initially kind of letting on here. Although, again, obviously I do like Shepard and Hunter. My problem is I'm just not big on this Colorado offense in general. I really think there's a decent shot that whole thing could completely implode, especially Pat Shurmur calling plays for Colorado this year. And so very much I just avoid Colorado in general. And Kiren Lacy, again, every point you made was spot on about, I'd much rather take Chris Bell or Ja'Cory Brooks later in the draft, and I'm not going to argue with there because I got Lacy at wide receiver 69. His ADP is 27. Ain't no way I'm touching that. Mm-hmm. So those are our guys we think are going too high. Let's flip the script here, Joe. Let's talk about some guys we think are going too low here. So I'll talk about my 3 guys here. Start with Xavier Henderson. This is probably like my poster child of guys that I think are just going way too low. His ADP is wide receiver 52. I got him at wide receiver 29. To me, a guy that got 98 targets last year and whose offense is set to improve this year should not be going past wide receiver 50. Again, 98 targets, 57 reception. That's a reception percentage of 58.2%, which is not great. Let's be real. But he only had 3 drops last year. So this really points to deficiency at quarterback when it came to intermediate and downfield passing, which is exactly what Emory Jones was bad at. And that's where Henderson usually does his work. He has an ADOT of 13.0. So in comes Brendan Sorsby. That should be a pretty solid upgrade in the passing department there. I think it's Satterfield really bringing in the guy that he wants to develop there. In addition, this passing attack loses Braden Smith and D. Wiggins, the clear number 2 and number 3 receivers from last year. That opens up 105 targets between them. Obviously, not all of those are going to Henderson. They bring in a couple of guys out of the transfer portal. But even so, that should easily open up enough opportunities, in my opinion, to get Henderson upwards of 105, 110 targets for the year and really make him a pretty solid asset for CFF, especially if he can get more than 3 to 5 touchdowns this year. Good Lord, Cincinnati, score a few more touchdowns, please, this year. My next guy here, Devin McEwen, wide receiver out of UTSA. I really think that this is going to be a guy that we're going to be looking back on once the season starts and be like, how did we let him get as low as ADP of wide receiver 63 here? I have him as wide receiver 34 in my ranks. I have bumped him up a little bit recently because I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm like, all right, why do I have this guy so low? Have we lost faith in Jeff Traylor to produce a good team, competent offense here? Between Zachary Franklin, Decorian Clark, Joshua Cephas, those three guys at some point or another have been stud receivers for CFF. Now, not all of them have played the full year, but all of them have shown points that like they're going to have a top end receiver in this offense. Even last year when Frank Harris was down a good chunk of the season, they weren't having good QB play. Joshua Cephas was still a top 20 wide receiver for CFF, right? In addition, Roadrunners, for the first time in a while, actually keep their offensive coordinator. They're not hired away. And so we can actually kind of project directly from last season what we might be able to expect here. McEwen, last year as a true freshman, by the way, second on the team in targets, played majority outside, 68% of his time, but played enough slot that it appears the staff is looking to move him over to the slot to kind of replace what role Joshua Cephas had last year. McEwen showed, because again, he played outside last year, now he's playing the slot, he can be moved around a lot like Cephas was able to last year. Some might point out, like, well, Jeff Traylor, if this is his offense, right? Like that's part of the reason why this offense has been so good the last couple of years is Traylor's been there to keep things going. You want to target the outside wide receiver. I would argue that was Will Stein and the other offensive coordinator. I can't remember his name. He's now in Illinois. That was them. This is Justin Burke now. Things are a little bit different now. And based on what we saw last year, he is very much either targets a slot or he is move your best guy around and get him mismatches, kind of like we talked about earlier. And I do think that's going to benefit McEwen quite a bit there. In addition, the outside wide receiver competition, in my opinion, is a little bit crazy, right? There's guys that you can point to and say, like, all right, I think he'll be the starter, but none of these guys are set in stone. Decorian Clark, if he's healthy, he's a starter, but he's been injured to hell and back. William McCoy, all right, seems like a pretty solid guy. JUCO transfer last year, only got 23 targets last year. That'd be a pretty big jump there. JJ Sparkman comes in from Texas Tech. He's gotten a lot of praise this offseason. But again, didn't really do much at Texas Tech here. And just because you get praise in the offseason doesn't mean it translates to on-field production. And then Chris Carpenter, another guy that transferred in last year, got only a few targets, more return man than receiver. So outside, I think, is a little bit more up in the air. Meanwhile, McEwen, I think, is the rock for this offense this year in terms of passing department. And last but not least, Chris Bell. Again, we talked about it earlier with Lacy being valued too high. Bell is my guy that I am locking in on in drafts right now. I have him as ranked as wide receiver 31. ADP has him down at wide receiver 74. Again, we mentioned earlier, Brom's system, target those outside wide receivers. You have to go back to Rondale Moore to find a slot receiver who dominated this offense, which basically means Lacy would have to be just a head and shoulders above talented receiver compared to everybody else, and that's just not the case when you have Bell and Brooks on the outside. And easily the receiver who's gotten the most buzz this offseason is Chris Bell. Yes, there was that report about Brooks having a really good practice day one of fall camp. I'm not changing my opinion just because of one really good practice there. The offseason smoke's been with Bell the whole time. I'm sticking with him here. I think he's highly underrated. Those are my three guys, Joe. What do you think, man?
We both like Chris Bell. I'm the type, I've been higher on Ja'Cory Brooks throughout the summer. Part of it for me was leaning toward a guy who had more career game appearances. So when you have a transfer coming over and they have a deeper history of, 30, 40, 50 games under their belt, they can probably quickly adapt into a new offense and be able to make a year one impact. So that was part of what had me favoring Brooks. As the summer went on, like you said, the smoke signals on Bell kind of started to flip me. That first scrimmage report about Brooks, my gut just said, you know what, go with what you originally thought, but I like both. And you can get both late. They're both cheap. It's really a question of which one's going to be the guy. And the things that stood out to me was that Bell has 1 year of experience in the offense. He scored more fantasy points than Brooks did last year. But Brooks has 11 more career game appearances than Bell. That's like when I boil it down to these two, the biggest difference. That year in the offense could be the thing that's helping him get that year two bump that makes him the top guy. And like we said before, Bell's a guy, hey, take a shot on him, and Brooks is kind of for free, or at the very least, you can get him in the last 3 rounds of any draft. So it's like I would say handcuff these two just because of how cheap they're going and how much Lacy is drawing the eyes from drafters to the wrong spot in the offense. But that helps us get these guys later. Going up then and looking at like McEwen, I think this whole passing game, the whole passing game's kind of screwy. Tight end. Do we really know, or excuse me, not tight end, quarterback. Do we really know what we're going to get out of that position now with a battle going? How reliable is the quarterback going to be? Clark is still rehabbing his injury, and a lot of the other talent, it is kind of projection based, picking based on Jeff Traylor's history. And you touched on something. He's had all these different coordinators, so his history is kind of mixed up. He is kind of the deepest history you could pull if you're going to look at a coach on this team. But at the same time, I don't think that it's the best data to use, because he, like, every year he was going through new coordinators, it seemed like. So it's definitely one of those. I think McEwen is probably the best talented guy. Agree with you. I would kind of be like, hey, let's go on talent. And like you said, like, he probably does have the highest floor and highest ceiling of everybody on that group. I still like, if it's like the last round, and I did it in the last Chasing the Natty best ball, I took a shot on Willie McCoy, but it was my last pick, very last pick of the draft, like, that's appropriate for some of these other guys. And then, with Henderson, sorry about that. My headphones keep slipping here. Henderson, he is one of my guys in my article series. I love him at receiver. The biggest things that stood out to me about him, he only had 3 touchdowns last year. He gets that to increase. His value is going to change big time. Head coach Scott Satterfield, his wide receiver 1 averages 10.7 targets a game. Henderson plays in the spot to be the wide receiver 1. He only averaged 7.6 targets last year. So there's a good amount of room for him to jump up just to hit averages. Like 11 or 12 is a little above average and still possible. So, like, he has a great range that he can improve, where this isn't just one of those, I'm falling in love with a guy and his name and I want to push him to the moon. Like, I see a lot of numbers that support how much better he can do. And now having Sorsby at quarterback, that's going to make a huge difference. For that quarterback play, and for him, especially like touchdowns, if they can actually start completing more deep balls, there's no way he should be sitting on 3 or 4 or 5 touchdowns next year.
All righty. Your 3 guys that you think are being drafted too low, you got Chris Brazell out of Tennessee here, Damon Ward out of North Texas, and Landon Ransom out of Rice. Talk to me about those 3 guys.
Yeah, with Brazell, this is a combination of talent and right spot in the system. So I got a question for you here, Jared. Off the top of your head, without checking anything, what was the point per game difference between Squirrel Wright and Brazell last year? If you had to guess.
I know White did not score a lot of touchdowns last year. That was kind of his main thing, because he actually had the targets that you kind of wanted to see. He had 98 targets and even missed a couple of games. So like that, he wasn't as bad as people were kind of saying last year. I would say probably you're looking at, because Brazell caught quite a few touchdowns, I'd say probably the difference between the two of them, 1.5.
Pretty close. 0.3 difference.
Okay, that wasn't close. That was off.
I'm humoring you. But that's just it. Like, a lot of people they don't realize they were that close last year.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing is, in this offense, it is the outside receiver. That's where you want to be. Squirrels in the slot where they're popping the ball short. He's getting the ball peppered a lot, but he's not being set up for the touchdown opportunities like the outside receiver is. And that's why that outside receiver is the guy that you want to target in Josh Heupel's offense. So with Brazell, he's already there. He's the best guy for that. Now we get a quarterback who can really rip it down the field. Like, if there's going to be a bump, it's not going to be Squirrel getting bubble screens. You know what I mean? He might get it if they're running like some RPO stuff and people are focusing on Nico in the running game. But I think Brazil, he's one of those guys I think will actually have a big jump up. I'm kind of viewing him in the same context as Nico for how much of a jump could be possible.
So real quick, I want to bring this up real quick because Jalen Hyatt did play. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was about to say I did want to say this that difference in point per game, as I mentioned earlier, I track half PPR. So it probably is a little bit bigger for Squirrel, or that gap's a little different when you're in a full PPR.
Hyatt played majority slot in the year that he absolutely went off for this system, right? So, and you're right, 100% right, that Cedric Tillman, the year he went off, was on the outside position there, right?
It's only been 1 year. The slot has been wide receiver 1, and you just hit it. Since 2018, only 1 year.
Okay. No, that makes sense. All right, continue.
Yeah. So I've been planting my flag on Brazil. He's a guy I've been targeting all summer long. So, I mean, so once again, I'm going to be like, I'll let people chase the squirrel. I'm going to go on the outside here. Damon Ward, he's someone that, fantasy owners need to get familiar with this guy. He was the second leading receiver last year, 59 targets, 5 touchdowns. Not half bad for number 2 guy. He plays on the outside, which is favored to be the wide receiver 1 in this system. The wide receiver 1 opened up with Germie Bernard transferring to Kentucky. He's in a great system. He's got experience under his belt. We don't know his name, but he has the snaps. So he's not going to be completely green moving into the wide receiver 1 spot. And he's currently, I think, 21st round ADP. I think that's criminally low for a North Texas wide receiver 1. So he's just a name that, everybody get familiar with him. I continue to steal him where I can, but everyone should be targeting this guy way higher than the 21st round. And then Landon Ransom over at Rice. I'll kind of throw out a couple quick fun facts here. The offensive coordinator at Rice, Marcus Tuiasosopo, he's another Washington Husky. Marcus Tuiasosopo, for those of you that don't know, is the first person in NCAA football history to run for 200 yards and throw for 300 yards in a single game. Nobody did it before him. We can get back to Landon here. He was the number 2 receiver last year. He plays a balanced mix of snaps from the outside and the slot. That's just like Luke McCaffrey did last year. So he's going to be able to transition over very easily to that wide receiver 1 spot, playing in the similar part of the offense. McCaffrey was targeted 124 times last year. So when you can eyeball someone that's going to get that much target share, it's a crying shame more fantasy owners haven't recognized Landon yet. I really do think he's a guy he's 27th round ADP. I've been reaching for him way above that. I'm not as high as a lot of other analysts when it comes to the Rice offense as a whole, but Landon's the guy I'm the highest on. Yeah,
Landon's a criminally low here, a 27th round wide receiver 101 in ADP. I personally drafted a ton of him to start the year. I kind of backed off a little bit because, like what I talked about earlier, when you start taking the same guy over and over again, you're like, maybe something's I'm crazy here, and I keep taking the wrong guy. But I'm getting back in on him as we get closer to the season because, what am I thinking? Damon Ward's another guy that I love. I've championed him basically since the start of the season for the exact reasons you were talking about, right? He's the only real outside wide receiver with experience returning to that offense. Yes, they bring in DT Sheffield. He mostly plays in the slot. Landon Sides, very impressive as a true freshman. He mostly played in the slot. And in addition to that, Sides is also injured now. If I get word that either Sides or Sheffield might move to that additional outside role, I might get a little bit more interested in them. But for right now, man, Ward, like you said, he's just kind of been that steady Eddie for this offense last year. In addition to Macklin, I think that he is best poised to take over for this number 1 option at wide receiver there. I definitely don't have him as high as your tier 3 here of wide receivers 7 through 18 here. but
I like him a lot.
I have him at wide receiver 40, but I have a ridiculous number of shares of him, and not to pat myself too much on the back, but I basically drove up his ADP earlier this offseason because I was just like, I can't not take him once he hits like the 15th round. Brazil, I think your point's very solid here. I think Brazil is going to be what a lot of people thought Dante Thornton was going to be last year, right? And I think there's a world where, again, if Nico's good enough that both Squirrel and Brazil can both go off in the same weeks. I just think that right now Brazil's clearly at the ADP discount here. Again, 67 in ADP. Meanwhile, Squirrel's going as high as, let's see if I can find him here real quick. Yeah, wide receiver 26. Massive gap between those two. So if you want to just take the shot on that system later, I would highly recommend you take Brazil over taking Squirrel as your third wide receiver. So, last but not least, to finish up our show here, man, we always talk about a couple of competitions that we want to see sorted. I'll go ahead and hit on mine because we already kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. I do want to see who kind of stands out here at Ohio State. Yes, I agree with you. The system, if it's Chip Kelly's system, is not very lovable for CFF, but the talent still matters here, right? And these are all three guys between Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, and Carnell Tate that maybe don't even need as much volume as we see other systems need to get their wide receivers to be CFF relevant for them to be able to pop off. They're going to be able to destroy a lot of these Big Ten defenses because they can just out-talent them. So I would love to find out between these three guys who's probably going to be the top guy there. I would probably rank them in order: Emeka, Carnell, then Jeremiah between the three of them. But regardless, I am going to be keeping an eye on like who's really standing out as the fall goes along. You, Joe, you have Washington, which I find interesting because most people are very in on Denzel Boston, although he did apparently get injured recently in practice, so something to note for everybody out there. But do you view this as a three-headed battle between Boston and two other guys here?
I kind of do. The first point I'm going to make, I did not pick Washington as a homer. I think this is a really unique situation, and it's hard to figure out. And I kind of feel like you got to work your way through it to unravel this. But the way I look at it, it's who's wide receiver 1, 2, and 3. And you kind of do need to pull the third receiver in to get a handle on this situation. Looking at Jedd Fisch's career history, it's a bit inconsistent when it comes to wide receiver roles. So it makes it a little hard. The one thing that is consistent is that the wide receiver 3 is always an outside receiver. That's the one thing that you can count on in this. So as we try and kind of like backward engineer this, Hunter and Boston both play on the outside. So one of those two very easily could end up being wide receiver 3. If we keep backward engineering this, wide receiver 2, it's been a mix of like every type of wide receiver role, no pattern. And sometimes I just call that talent. They'll just take whoever the second best guy is and just pepper the ball to him. So there's not a lot to read out of wide receiver 2 right there. Wide receiver 1 has been a slot twice. It's been an outside receiver once. Now Giles Jackson, who it's not on the screen, but he's the third guy that you're going to find at Washington. He's going to be the slot player. He's not nearly as talented as Boston and Hunter are. So as I kind of look at this scenario, my first main question is, what wide receiver role will be wide receiver 1? Fisch changed the wide receiver 1 to an outside receiver last year because of T-Mac's talent. But before that, he was favoring a slot. So we know that he could break from system tendencies to go with talent. So Boston or Hunter, they're definitely more talented than Giles Jackson. I would kind of lean that way, that I think one of those two should probably end up wide receiver 1 based on talent. And I'm going to ignore I think there's only 3 years of history that I have for Fisch at Arizona. So it's not a huge sample size. But I'm going to bet that Fisch is going to decide to focus on talent for the wide receiver 1. The next main question, who is more talented, Hunter or Boston? And I do think that's a legitimate question. Hunter, and they're both very different profiles of players. Hunter, 31 career game appearances. He averaged 11.7 points per game in a half PPR last year. Boston, only 18 career appearances, He has been a scout team standout last year. We've had steady drum beats and praise throughout the spring. And I can't tell you who I think will actually be number one. I can see a scenario where either one of these guys can end up being the number one. So as we look at this and we say, okay, one of these two guys will probably be the wide receiver one. If the wide receiver three is always an outside guy, it basically means that the slot position will probably be the wide receiver two. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway to look at this, because Giles Jackson is probably free in drafts right now. If you can get a guy in the last couple rounds of the draft that might be a wide receiver two in this offense, I think that's a good bet that you can make. Because if Fish has never had a slot receiver as his wide receiver three, why would Giles Jackson finish there? I think the wide receiver two fluctuates so much because of what we mentioned about the wide receiver one. He had a slot that was his best guy. He featured that guy. Then he got T-Mac. He's on the outside. He featured that guy. So I kind of think that everything's going to kind of fall in line with that, but knowing that the slot's going to be number one or number two. It's not going to be number three in this. So I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway that most people aren't looking at is I think Giles Jackson, super late of the draft flyer that you should take a shot on. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer, which is why I wanted to bring up this competition. I don't have an answer on who I think will be better between Hunter and Boston, but Boston has that steady drumbeat and the praise. Hunter has the experience.
Yeah, I would say I personally would go after Boston in this scenario, right? Where you already mentioned I'm a huge fan of the steady drumbeat philosophy, right? And especially when it gets confirmed in game settings, right? It's one thing if I hear, oh, good Boston report, good Boston report, good Boston report. The spring game came along and dadgummit, if it didn't look like that, Will Rogers was just throwing to him on every other play. Right. To me, it was very clear that Boston was a guy that is going to be featured quite a bit in this offense. And if you're asking me, then, all right, Boston or Jeremiah, one of them's going to be the wide receiver one of them's going to be the wide receiver three. I have to go with the guy that at least I've seen between the two in this offense. Looks like he's further along than the other one. So I personally would go with Boston. I'm happy to hear you pumping up Giles Jackson here a little bit because early on in the offseason, I did actually take a couple of shots on Jackson when I thought he was the best returning option for this team. But obviously, a lot of things have happened since then. But even so, if you're telling me I'm locking into a wide receiver two and a team that's going to be forced to pass a ton this offseason or this season, I am A-okay with that. So, alrighty. Joe, great show, man. We ran long, but lots of great information here, man. I appreciate you coming on. Before we get out of here, just remind everybody, one, where they can find you, how to spell your stuff correctly, and just what kind of stuff you're going to be offering in season, especially with it being right around the corner. People are really going to want to start looking for stuff like that. So take it away, man.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter or X at UW_purple_rain, REIGN. And my brand new website, letpurplerain.com. That's where I'm posting all of my content in season. What I'll be doing is posting articles every Sunday through Wednesday, where you're going to be putting together articles where you're going to look at who should you keep on your roster or who should you cut for the upcoming waiver wire. Be going over waiver wire targets for you to pick up. I'm going to be doing weekly player rankings, and then I'm also going to be doing start sits, possibly working on some collaboration work for start sit. And when that time comes, I'll actually be putting out questions as well for readers. So you can send in your questions for start sit, a lot like you do, Jared, and be able to give some personalized answers besides just my own personal picks. But like 4 articles a week, every week in season is what I got planned for everybody.
And tell everybody, how much is it a month to subscribe?
Per month, it's $7. I do give a bigger discount annually, so $60 for the year. $7 per month. That allows people that if you just want it for a certain part of the season, you can go ahead and go per month. The value is per year. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, I'll be doing articles all year long. So even though some of the information periods, as you know, Jared, could be a little dead, there's still going to be content coming out so you get your money's worth.
Absolutely. Again, it sounds like a steal to me.
And there is some, so we do allow some small free previews. Another announcement, I just thought of this, so I'm glad that we have the time here. Once the season starts, anything that is now old information on the website will become completely free. Draft guide, everything about drafts will become completely free. The paywall will just be at the current part of the year that you're in. And I plan on doing that all year long. So when this season is over and we hit January, everything that's been released in over the course of the regular season, that will become fully free.
So basically a great way at the end of the season for people to kind of go back, look at what we were thinking back in, preseason, during the season, now that we're in the postseason, like what can we learn from that? So sounds like a great deal to me. In terms of what we got going on here at campuscanton.com, again, we're finishing up here our crash course series right here with the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. We got some fall camp news we'll be focusing on over the next couple of weeks. And then before we know it, we're going to be doing week 0 previews, which is just absolutely insane to me. It's so crazy how quickly we've gotten to the end of this offseason. And again, with that, we'll have our in-season content going up again. We'll be back to 2 shows a week during the regular season. You guys know how it goes, the waiver wire shows and the start-sit shows. We are going to be redoing the start-sit shows just a little bit in terms of the content there. So we'll provide more detail on that as we get closer to the season there. In addition, check out the Kings Classic Draft if you have not already. This is releasing on Monday, so it should be up on YouTube. It is myself and 13 other experts. It is hosted by Matt Hicks over at Rookie Big Board and, of course, John Lobb. They've hosted the last 3 years. This will be our 4th year doing it. It will be a ton of fun. We'll be drafting live from the Hall of Fame, probably, in my opinion, the biggest fantasy or college fantasy draft of the entire season. It's a ton of fun. So go check out that stream as well, and check out the rest of our awesome stuff over at campuscanton.com. With that, we come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you've not already, leave the like, comment, and subscribe. If you're on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show, leave a 5-star review where you can. Again, like I said, we'll see you guys back here next Monday when we start breaking down some of this fall camp news that has been driving us all up and down the wall. Until then, really appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.